Hello and welcome to the University of Ontario Debate Society Introduction to Debate series. We're now moving on to our fifth module. As of now, we've covered what formal debating is and what are the ingredients that it is made out of. We have covered what motions/topics are and how to approach them. We have covered understanding debate from a very top level and the different theories you should understand to guide your different decisions in debating. And then lastly, we've covered manner/style, which is the way that you say things. Now we're moving on to what you say, the actual content, and how to approach argumentation. Understanding argumentation. As mentioned earlier, arguments either serve to defend a team's side or attack the opposite team's side. You should try to aim to do both of these in debate. Argumentation is important because it is how debaters persuade judges through their matter/analysis. So again, this is the point at which the debaters are convincing judges through what they say, not how they say it. There are three different tools teams use to engage in argumentation that you're going to have to be familiar with because these are the three main tool buckets that you're going to have at your disposal for debating. One, constructive argumentation. Arguments that are made in support of your side of the debate. For example, I support this because X, Y, and Z. Again, constructive implies building something up, so you're building up your side, defending your side. Refutation is criticisms of the arguments made by the other side. Refutation or rebuttal. It goes either way. You could use both those terms interchangeably. This is you saying the other side is wrong or not important, etc. It is you attacking their case. Lastly, we have rebuilding. This is the process of strengthening your constructive argumentation by adding more analysis after the opponents attack your arguments. So basically, your adversaries are going to say arguments against your case, and you're going to have to, kind of like a house that was toppled, rebuild it to make it strong again. So address all the different things that they said against your case, or add new layers of analysis to make it more deep. The way that I like to present these different tools is that of a war and with the castle analogy. Here we have three different types of things that you do in terms of this war. Hypothetically, firstly, you're going to have to build a castle to win the war. So you're going to construct this castle, and that's what constructive arguments are as an analogy. They are building up to defend your side. These are the arguments in support of your case. Then you're going to have to attack, and you're going to be attacked. This is the tool of rebuttal, which is like catapults attacking the castles or troops or whatever. This is the point at which, by analogy, you are using arguments against your adversary, or they're using arguments against you to explain why your case is not true or is unimportant. Lastly, we have rebuilding, which is after the fact of being attacked, you are going to want to rebuild your castle to be stronger and better. And eventually, the team that has the best castle standing is going to be the one that's going to win. Constructive argumentation and structure. So I want to first point out something incredibly important because I was taught as a debater one conception of argumentation, and it took me a lot of time to de-learn this kind of conception. And to be quite honest, it took a very big tax on my flexibility in debate rounds. Good arguments are inherently lucid. Lucid meaning that they could fluctuate and they depend in context. This is because, whether intentionally or not, there's going to be different situations where different forms of argumentation are better. So what I'm trying to say is I'm going to provide you a structure to argumentation that you should follow and a substructure to analysis that you can follow in certain contexts. But I highly encourage you to use the methods that work best for you. We're just going to provide you some tools that you could use and that are beginner friendly. This is incredibly important because otherwise you're going to be trying to apply these different frameworks in cases where they might not be useful or applicable, which will lead you to make bad arguments. Ultimately, as long as your argument really proves it's in support of your side, is proven to be true, and proven to be important, again, as we mentioned in our slides and our modules about disagreement and the principles of it, then that will be an argument that exists and is good, hopefully. However, the substructure of an argument should still try to be consistent. And this is where we use the POW format. This is something just like similar to how I mentioned in the style seminar or module where I discussed how you should structure your speech. You should always structure your arguments in this manner. So how you should do it. One, you should have a point. This is where you would say probably our first point is that yada, yada, yada. The sentence that you want to judge, to remember, and the conclusion to your analysis is your point. I'll give more examples, an example of an argument once we get to that point. Secondly, you're going to want to have analysis. This is the explanation of why your point is true and why your point matters. That is what analysis is. So this is where you might want to fill your section with the why is this true and why is this important. So again, you have your point title, which is like the heading that you want the judge to remember. For example, if you did this house would ban zoos, maybe it is that the point might be that you are going to reduce animal cruelty, or you're going to be able to provide animals a better living environment by banning them, by banning zoos. These are all fine examples of points. They're what you want the judge to remember, and they're the conclusion of your analysis. The link then is basically the point at which you say because your point is true, that it should have the end consequence of supporting your side of the debate. So for example, therefore, because we proved this point to be true, we should support the motion. This is just a summary statement reaffirming that the whole point of your argument in the first place is to defend your side and for you to construct and to make sure that it is clear why your side should be supported. Right here is a little diagram that points to how this structure works. So you have your point title, you have your analysis, and as I've mentioned before, you could approach your analysis in many different ways. We are going to teach you one way. The most surface and easy way to do it is just asking yourself, why is this true and why is this important? This is the bread and butter approach that is super surface level. And then you want to link it back to why specifically your point being true and important helps your case or is in support of your case. Now, you might be wondering how we approach analysis then, since beyond asking yourself, why is this true and why is this important, what are some of these other methods that I keep on alluding to? This is what I'm going to share to you right now. So again, as I mentioned, good analysis should satisfy the two dimensions of an argument, truthness and importance. There are many different ways to structure your analysis, which again varies depending on the motion. But the NAT framework for analysis is highly recommended for beginners as it is able to convey how something changes for better or worse. And as you remember, how we describe motions is that they usually describe some kind of change. So if motions are a type of topic that typically talk about some kind of change, then having an analysis structure that is able to explain why that change makes things better or worse, that probably makes sense in a lot of contexts. This is a very common argumentative approach to understand a debate. So this analysis portion, you could kind of plug in like a block, right? So right here, you have your point and link, and you could plug in the NAT framework in the middle of it. So it would basically be POW with NAT being the analysis portion of it. So how do you go by doing this? One, you explain the now. At this point, you should illustrate the world prior to the motion, because again, the motion typically indicates some kind of change. For example, this house would ban guns. The change is that you are banning guns. Or this house prefers a world with superheroes is implying some kind of world where there are superheroes where before we didn't have any. There's some kind of change that's going to have to occur. Government's teams typically try to describe some kind of problem that exists. Meanwhile, opposition teams either detail a problem or some kind of advantage. You will see how this works. Secondly, action, the A in that, otherwise known synonymously as mechanisms. This stage is where a speaker should lay out how the motion, whether it be policy or an action, changes things, also known again as the mechanism. So for example, if we have a problem, let's just say in banning zoos, the problem that we're trying to address is animal cruelty, then the mechanisms is how is animal cruelty going to change by us banning zoos? What does it exactly do to change things? And that's why it's also a mechanism, right? It is a mechanism kind of implies that it is some kind of system that is going to change something, or is it kind of these gears and steps that's going to change something? Lastly, we have the then, which is the impacts. This is where teams should identify and explain the consequences of the action. Impacts, implications, those are all synonymous. Government should explain how things get meaningfully better and how the motion acts as a solution and is better than the comparative. Remember, we learned this term when we were talking about broad level understanding of debate. Comparative is what the other side has to defend. So you need to explain why what you're defending is better than what the other side is defending, which again makes a lot of intuitive sense in debate when you are really comparing why your side is better than the other side or is more right than the other side. While opposition should explain how the motion either takes some kind of advantage away, such as say there was something that was good, and now the motion by doing it is going to have the byproduct of taking away this kind of advantage that we still want, or that there was some kind of problem that exists before, like let's just say poverty, and somehow by implementing the motion, it makes this problem worse, which again is probably undesirable. This structure of analysis is really good because it automatically is able to prove some level of importance, right? By explaining that there's some kind of problem that has bad effects on people and that the motion solves for this problem, or that there's some kind of problem or benefit and this motion makes it worse on opposition, you are able to easily explain a case that seems relevant and has some level of nuance. So now let's have some considerations now that we understand how this analysis portion works. The first thing is that I highly implore you to engage in this process called tiering. Tiering means to add multiple independent pieces of analysis to support a point. For instance, there could be more than one reason why something is true and important. If you've watched the previous modules and some of the argument examples, even the simple argument examples that I have given, there was multiple reasons why I supported the point to be true and important. So make sure that you try to strengthen the analysis by adding more depth, because then it makes it harder to respond to. Right here in this little diagram, as you could see, we have the example of having a point with one mechanism and one impact. Again, mechanism is how the motion changes things for the better, and the impact is how things get better after the point's proven true. And meanwhile, here we have, imagine you have three different mechanisms that explain how the point, how the motion changes things, and then two different reasons why its effects might be good or bad. This obviously probably makes for a more strong and deep case. Secondly, never take for granted that an argument is true. This is a mistake a lot of debaters make where they kind of think that they said something that is pretty self-evident or that it is sufficient, but often they kind of leave it at an assertion. Even if you think that it is pretty true in most situations, you still need to walk me like a baby through the steps to explain why it is true. So make sure to keep asking yourself the questions, why is this true and so at every logical step until your points could boil down to the least disputable truths. Thirdly, try to be specific. This is especially important for explaining impacts or implications. Consider who is affected by these different arguments, in what ways, to what degrees, in which contexts. These will all make a better illustration of what is going on. And if you're really able to make the judge see exactly how your argument and / the motion affects things, then it makes it a lot easier for them to credit for you for the importance of your argument. So 3 more considerations. One, employ illustrations and examples throughout the speech. As you might have noticed, and maybe once you were in high school, you had an argument structure, essay structure, where you're specifically supposed to input examples in a certain part of the essay. This is not the case for what we teach in debating. The main reason why is because examples and illustrations seek to make a case seem more realistic or an argument more realistic by drawing from real world. So making this sprinkling these types of things throughout your speech where it is applicable is always a good thing. Good debaters try to ground their arguments through a lot of examples and illustrations when necessary. So you don't need to have one point at which you have examples and illustrations. Try to sprinkle them throughout. So again, the PAL structure does not specify part of the arrangement or examples ought to be put in, but rather that they should be scattered across the speech. Mechanisms should have proportionate impacts. The idea here is that you do not want to be unreasonable. Again, if mechanisms by definition is how the motion changes things and impacts are the implications of the motion changes things, then you want to make sure that you explain and connect how the motion changes things to how it affects things. Because you can't necessarily try to push that something that probably doesn't change much is going to have a lot of change, right? For example, if you are saying that you're going to increase taxes by 1% and that's going to build thousands of schools, create universal healthcare, and save the environment while no one feels any outcome from the loss of money from increased taxes, then that's probably not a reasonable case and doesn't really make sense. So don't do that because it gives on a ground for adversary teams and a ground for judges to call you unreasonable, even if your case had a reasonable point to it. Lastly, be as comparative as possible. As I mentioned, comparative could be used in two ways here. One, comparative is the other side of the debate, but being comparative also means to make sure that you're comparing between your side and their side. So you want to make sure that you are comparing between the different alternatives and situations offered between both sides in your arguments, because that is what the activity of debate demands. That's how you do the best possible way. All right. In case you are confused, I'm now going to walk you through two constructive argument examples, which you could potentially copy over as a model for yourself to kind of look over in case that you're confused in some of your first debates. And I also have an argument substructure on the side within that framework incorporated in it. So the motion that we have here as an example is this House would adopt gender quota policies in corporate senior management. The point that we have in support of this, and to get this point, ask yourself, why would we want to adopt gender quota policies and corporate senior management, was that we ensure that more women are represented in corporate senior management by having gender quota policies. So how do we go by the analysis to prove this point and prove that it is important that we have more women represented in corporate senior management? The before the motion is implemented. Too few women are represented in the upper echelons of business. This is true because one, women are discriminated against in hiring policies, but two, women often face hostile working environments from the ground up, which impairs their ability to move up. Both of these are independent reasons to why it's true that too few women are represented in upper echelons of business. Again, I'm trying to indicate that this feature of tiering is really important and it makes for really strong arguments. Now, what is the action of this motion? By implementing the gender quota policy, which is again is the action, we ensure that there will be at least more women in senior management because now corporations have to hire women to fill these spots. So that's how this motion changes things. It makes it that if before there was not enough women for all these reasons, this motion now makes it that you have to have women. Now, why is this important? Why is it important that we have these women represented? What are the implications, the impacts? It is good because one, women in senior positions are likely to pass policies that make workplaces less hostile. So, for example, things like maternity leave. Two, people become normalized to working with and under women in senior positions. And three, more women strive for upper echelons when they have role models and know that a place is allotted to them, which are all evidently things that are probably good. The link then becomes, therefore, because we got more women representing corporate senior management, we reaffirm our side, which means we reaffirm implementing gender quota policies. Again, very simple argument, uses causal chains, problem, solution. The motion is a solution. We'll explain why it's good and what implications it has. Another example, just because I want you to understand it very well. The motion we have here is this House to legalize drugs. Again, we are in government. The point we made in support of this case is our first point is that we disempower drug cartels by legalizing all drugs. So now let's walk through the problem and how this motion acts for a solution. The now is that drug cartels are really, really powerful. This is true because they're able to be the sole suppliers of drugs because there's a high barrier to entry. Since, for example, you could be arrested if you start a drug business, which means that they have basically full control of the market because no one really wants to go into business where they could get arrested. And secondly, because they have little competition, in large part because of that. Also because there's general discouragement of running drug businesses, etc., a lot of liability, yada, yada. So how does this motion change things? How does legalizing drugs disempower drug cartels? One, it does this because new suppliers can join the market without fearing cartel and government repercussions, right? Because again, before, that you were fearful that you would get targeted by the government and the FBI and CIA or whatever types of forces are responsible for dealing with you, like anti-drug uh, government agencies or cartel agencies. And also cartels would try to take you out, right? They could use whatever mediums because they operate in the dark side of the economy, in the dark side of the law. So they don't want competition, they want more money. So you're able now to incur more competition and have more businesses join the drug industry. Secondly, people buy drugs from these non-controlled sources because they have more options and perceive it as safer. So it was not enough to just say that there's going to be more suppliers. We have to prove that people are actually going to pick these suppliers, and this kind of proves that idea because similar to like how weed was legalized in Canada, individuals often perceive these drugs as more safe, so they want to buy them. So now we kind of have this idea as drugs are going to have less funding, which means we disempower them because now they're not able to use this money for criminal activity, murder, rigging elections, etc., which are things that we determine as bad. Now, because we disempower drug cartels, we should legalize all drugs. That's the link. That's how this argument supports the motion or your side of the debate. So now we're going to move on to making a constructive argument. So as with all other activities, I'm going to present to you the different prompt or activity that you have to do. If there's an answer located in it, I will present the answer after time for preparation. If not, I implore you to try to do it by yourself or to try to do it with someone else. Let's just say a roommate, present your argument to them and get some feedback. So in this case, there's listed topic options and also an argument substructure. I'm going to read out the topic options. You could then pause the video if you want to try it. And then after that, we're going to move on with the next portion of this module. So we have this house would make voting compulsory. This house supports an 100% inheritance tax. This house believes that children should not be allowed to participate in religious activities. This house would impose a tax on unhealthy foods. And this house regrets the new politics of the campus left. So now I'll give you 10 seconds. All right, now let's move on to our next tool. You are now masters of constructive argumentation. Note that, yes, that was a lot, and yes, it might be confusing. But as you start debating, it will become second nature. There's not really much more to debating. That is really it. All these different tools you're going to use, you're going to become more skilled and capable of applying them and using them in the right ways. But broadly speaking, everything that you learn is going to be most of the theory that you're probably ever going to have to learn about debate. It's the same way that in soccer, you're going to have to learn how to kick properly. This is the equivalent. After you know how to kick, you could become better at it, you could become better dribbling, but knowing how to kick is pretty fundamental, and taking the time to do that and learning through the proper steps, definitely important to not botch it. Let's move on to rebuttal and how do you structure it. Rebuttal in its most general form refers to the responses one gives to things said by an opposing team. Constructive argumentation is used to prove the truth and importance of a claim, while rebuttal or refutation is utilized to render a claim false and irrelevant, so things that they say. So how do we structure this? There's 3-point structure. 1, identify an opponent's argument. This is where you say basically they said X, Y, and Z. You want to provide a clear, concise outline of what is being referred to without granting the adversary free airtime. The summary should be impartial and charitable. You do not want to misrepresent as it weakens potential responses. So again, you don't want to spend like 2 minutes talking about what they said because you're giving them too much free time, but you also do not want to give a bad representation of their argument because it means you're not going to be responding to it charitably and it's not going to do you any service either. Secondly, provide a tiered critique of opposing arguments. As you could see, the word tiered came up again. You want to try to give multiple reasons as to why their argument is not true and not important. So again, effective rebuttal should be layered and provide more than one reason as to why an adversary's team analysis is unconvincing. So it should ideally both try to demonstrate why a contribution is not true and, even if true, unimportant. This is incredibly important of an idea because a lot of debaters try to only explain, especially beginner ones, why the other side is just straight up wrong. That's not always the case. Sometimes they're going to be right about things they're saying, otherwise there wouldn't be a debate. Sometimes it's just better explain why, even if their argument's true, why it's not important. Maybe it doesn't affect the right people. Maybe it doesn't affect as many people as you. Maybe it doesn't have the consequences that you think are most desirable in this debate. Try to explain those ideas Addressing unimportance is definitely much harder of a thing to rebuttal than just saying their point's not true, but it's definitely goes a far way in being effective in winning. So this is where you say, however we say. So again, as of now, I say, they said this, however we say this in response. Lastly, you have the explanation of the significance of the rebuttal. So that therefore, now that you've disproved their point or explained why it's unimportant, I want you to explain what the rebuttal achieves in terms of the round or the broader strategical implications. So did it take down an assumption that their point was predicated on, thus their whole point falls? Does it mitigate some of the harms that they presented for their argument? So maybe they said that they solve World War III or prevent it from happening. Maybe they don't actually get that. Maybe they reduce the chances of conflict, but maybe they don't make it that World War III will never happen, right? So, or does it completely take the other point? Try to point out what the implication of your refutation is to the judge so they know exactly what it does in the context of the debate, and you don't leave them questioning or trying to figure out on their own. So, rebuttal approaches. What are different ways they could do this? Again, this is the type of thing that you're going to get better at as time goes on. I'll give you some examples of all of these things and how you could use them, but ultimately, I think it will become very intuitive. You'll hear arguments, you'll start to use critical thinking to try to see how you can take them down, and that's going to be your main process of learning different approaches for rebuttal. These are just the terms and names for them that you're going to suddenly realize, like, oh, what I did was this type of refutation. So there are many different ways to rebut an argument, but at its core, you are simply trying to prove a claim untrue and unimportant, as mentioned earlier. Here are some popular approaches, and this is a non-exhaustive list that you could use to rebut. One, you could attack causality. This is explaining how the motion does not lead to their claim or claim to their impacts, right? So as you mentioned before, for example, in the NAT analysis framework, you're explaining how there's a problem, how the motion solves for this problem, and after how there's good implications of this. Attacking the causal links or the different chains of this is basically saying that what there's no truth to that the things they say happen don't actually happen, right? And this is a very powerful way of refutation, because if you're able to disprove their chain of reasoning, then at some point they're able to disturb it and prove that maybe their outcomes do not happen the way that they say they do. Secondly, is addressing validity. This is where you show that the facts that the arguments rest on are not true. So if they say the sky is green, you could say probably conventional knowledge indicates that the sky is blue. So sometimes people say untrue things, like maybe they say politicians are totally motivated by the population and representing their interests, right? Most people would probably say that that might be some of the things that they're motivated on, but it's probably not true that this is the only thing that they're motivated by. Maybe they're motivated by reputation, by clout, and trying to have a legacy and impact on a political system, or maybe the money and funds that you get from as a job from being a politician. So there's definitely a lot of reasons why that could be true. Thirdly, you could demonstrate how their claim is actually maybe true in terms of the causal change, but it actually leads to bad impacts or bad outcomes, right? So yes, maybe all the logical steps by which their argument are true, but they didn't really consider what are the negative implications of their argument being true. And so you could provide those and explain how that flips their argument to explain why it's bad, and then it's in support of your side. Fourthly, we have mitigation. This is where you downplay the significance of their impacts. Do not doubt the importance of mitigation. So let's just say you think you can't take down their whole case and that there's some truth to it, and there's some truth to the things that they said as implications. Try to explain how their implications are just not as good as they say they are. Maybe they don't affect as many people. Maybe they don't have the same depth of impact that they claim it does. Try to shrink their argument. Next, we have uncomparative. So these are outcomes that you think are going to happen regardless of this motion and whether it's implemented or not. So let's just say if like people are getting $100, you could basically say that this motion changes nothing and people are going to get $100 anyways. So it doesn't really matter if this motion is implemented. It doesn't have a unique benefit per se. And then lastly, unnecessary and irrelevant are basically things that either do not prove what they need to prove or just lie completely outside the scope of the debate. So arguments that are kind of just unnecessary or just do not serve to continue the case of their side. Again, you will learn these things more in depth. I would broadly say that if you are trying to prove an argument untrue and unimportant, just think about that. Ask yourself, why is their claim untrue? Why is it unimportant? I'm going to keep connecting these things back because obviously there's a more complicated understanding of the debate that I'm presenting to you. But at its core, you are literally trying to prove arguments true and important, and then you're trying to prove their arguments untrue and important. These are just more specific ways to do all these things. Now I'm going to be doing an activity of refuting claims and arguments. There's going to be a couple of different claims here. I'll give you 5 seconds and then we'll take it up each one. So make sure to pause if you want to try each of these different arguments and activities and refuting them. First one, cats have fur, I have fur, therefore I am a cat. The answer here is that this addresses validity because the person arguing this did not fully describe the characteristics that are required to be a cat. As we all know, cats definitely have a lot more features than fur. So just because we share one similarity, for example, I have a heart, a cat has a heart, that means heart means I'm a cat. That's definitely not equivalent. Second claim, either you like apples or bananas, there's no other option. And here this addresses validity and it presents a false dichotomy. A false dichotomy is a false decision between two choices. There's basically someone presents to you that there's only two options. We all know that there might be, it's not just binary, it's not black and white, there might be a gray space. For example, as in this instance, it is clear that there are more fruits than apples or bananas or more foods. So people could like things beyond apples or bananas. It doesn't have to be just between those. Or maybe you like both. Third claim, last few times we flipped the coin, it said heads, therefore it is more likely the next flip will be tails. The answer here is that tax causality and it also has a false causation. As we know of probabilities, just because a coin flipped one way once and it was a 50% chance does not indicate that it's more likely that the next time you flip the coin, it's going to come out in the way that you want it to. So there is no effect on one previous flip or one previous moment of probability onto the next one. Fourthly, capital punishment is good because it deters people from committing crimes such as murder. This one's definitely more complicated. So this argument's not fundamentally wrong, right? There's definitely reasons to believe that it does deter people from committing crimes. Here's an example of a refutation you could use, assuming that you were in a motion that a capital punishment. You could attack causality. You could say that most murders are actually an act of passion and not the product of irrational contemplation. AKA, most people don't premeditate. It's more like something really bad happened, like maybe your partner cheated on you and you have a violent outburst. Since people won't ponder the consequences of their actions, that means there isn't really deterrent effect because people won't think that, oh, I'm going to be sent to prison while murdering someone. They're doing it because of whatever emotions in the heat of the moment. And because of that, this doesn't really deter anything from happening. Fifth argument, increasing taxes causes people to spend less, which causes businesses to shut down, which causes an economic collapse. Again, this is an instance of attack causality, but you could also do some mitigation. It's probably untrue that increasing taxes on its own causes an economic collapse. So that means that you could basically say that just because you increase taxes, it won't lead to the final outcome of economic collapse, that they kind of jump a lot of different steps to get there. And that depends obviously how much you increase taxes, that if you increase taxes marginally, it won't lead to the business collapses. Maybe some go out of business, but it's unclear that taxes on their own are a sufficient threshold to create a complete disruption in this level. But secondly, you could also mitigate. Even if it does cause people to spend less money, the money collected could be used to fund more social services that help people. So even if we assume that it could cause like economic collapse or some degree of it, the money that they collect, this tax money could be used to provide social services to give people a kind of float. So that means that it won't lead to like all the different bad things that they might think would happen out of an economic collapse. Lastly, Donald Trump was a popular president because he had a 40% approval rating. All right. The answer here is addresses validity. It is true that Donald Trump did have a 40% approval rating at some points, which definitely doesn't make him like completely unfavorable. But he also had above 40% disapproval rating. So maybe he was popular for other reasons, but he definitely wasn't popular based on this quantitative quantitative metric that the 40% probably subtracted by the disapproval rating indicates that he was unpopular, at least by the numbers. All right, now you know refutation and how to approach it and how you should structure it. Moving on to the last thing, rebuilding, which will be far quicker. We're going to be talking about the structure first. So rebuilding is a process of addressing the arguments made against your partner's constructed arguments. So basically refutation. So some easy way to conceptualize it, and one way that rebuilding works, is that it's like rebuttal to their rebuttal, right? They said stuff against your case. You're going to say, oh, here's how my case is actually still good. So one, you're going to want to restate the original argument that your partner said. So state the central point or tag of the arguments using similar words to those of your partner. This is for clarity and it should be brief. You don't want to spend a lot of time repeating your partner's points, just the point that you're referring to. To respond to the opponent's refutation, they said blah, 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 blah. The refutation is insufficient. You have to also make sure you summarize their response to your point. What did they say in response to your point or your partner's point? You should take the most charitable reading of the refutation, as the opposition might have more opportunities to respond. So, or the other side. So if you give a very bad response, then they're just going to point that out. Lastly, explain the strategic implications of your rebuilding. Does your point still stand? Does it rebuild some kind of chain of logic? Does it strengthen it? Does that mean that the opposition hasn't adequately dealt with their argument, etc.? So again, this is basically the same structure as refutation. The only real difference is that now you're adding on top of it what your partner said, and then you're doing refutation to what they said to your partner. So what are the different rebuilding approaches? There are many different ways to approach rebuilding. Listed are some of the common methods used by debaters. I also want to make a quick comment to mention that rebuilding does not only require you, or you don't only have to, for example, just address what they said to your partner's case. By technicality, rebuilding also includes adding more arguments or more depth to your partner's case. For example, maybe they just really didn't respond to your case that much, which is their fault, and they will be penalized for that, and that makes them less persuasive, but you still have extra time. You could still rebuild by adding more arguments to your partner's case. So one, you could point out what parts of your argument that the opponent did not address as kind of like a push point to say, like, hey, these are important things that they did not talk about. Two, you could press out the flaws in their response. So basically refuting their refutation. So you could use the similar tools that we talked about to refuting arguments in this instance. Thirdly, you could call out refutation that only deals with a portion of your argument, but not the argument at its best, right? Because sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, people have a tendency to refute points, but not deal with them at a charitable level, but take them in a very straw man or bad way. So you could point out that they did that and have to explain why that it is important that they didn't take your argument at its best. Fourthly, you could respond to your opponent's responses by referring to the argument you made in your case, or you could add new argument analysis. You could support your argument with new analysis or evidence to restrain it. This is also known as extending. You could add more to your argument or by presenting new supports or an evidence. So these are all the different tools that you have at your disposal for rebuilding. The last two things are rebuilding considerations. One, don't just give the same analysis. Respond to the rebuttal, flag insufficient responses, and develop areas of limit analysis. It is an absolute waste of your time, especially if you're debating with a partner, or even if you're just you, to repeat the exact same things that you said or your partner said. These are not meaningful contributions and they're not persuasive because if the judge already took note of what you said in your argument, I'm sure they know what it is. Saying stuff that pushes the ball further is much more valuable, especially because you have a limited amount of time. Secondly, don't undersell the analysis when you're building it. Make sure not to say your partner did something bad or you did something bad because you think that they had some truth to what they said. Try to remain strong, not be cocky, but make sure that you do not undersell what you had said before or what your partner had said before. All right, so in total, we have covered the three different tools that are used in debating. You're going to use them very often. You're going to make arguments, you're going to respond to arguments, and then you're going to use rebuilding as this kind of quirky extra tool, depending on what position you are in debating and your experience with it. These are all very valuable, and there's a lot of different frameworks and understandings to these things. So make sure to try to write down all the different frameworks, the order, the templates to how to say things, the different lists of options of how to approach things, because it will definitely help you as a beginner debater. Thank you for your time.